So I'm Luke Rogers. I'm from the University of Washington. I got started with the small forest landowner community back in 2001 when I was hired to work as part of the Rural Technology Initiative, doing training, education, outreach for small forest landowners to help them with the complex rules that came as part of the Forest and Fish Agreement. Since that time, I've done a lot of things. It's hard to even comprehend all of the work we've done to try and understand the forest land base here in Washington. So I was asked to come here and kind of talk about a few things, and I will talk a little bit about this. One thing that I guess there's two goals that I have for this talk. One is to, I guess, impress upon you the difference between small forest landowners and some of our larger industrial owners, just to kind of characterize some of those differences. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and then also want to impress upon you the investment that this community has made in helping to actually understand the forest land base here in Washington. Without the investments that WFFA and some other organizations have made, we really wouldn't have any understanding of kind of the distribution of the small landowners around the state, large landowners as well, and some of the other statistics that I'm going to talk about. So those are kind of my two goals, and then I'll talk a little bit about these other things as well. So in order to do that, I want to establish some of the history of how we got to where we are with some of this understanding. You all know about the Salmon Recovery Act, Forest Fish Agreement. Part of that, the Small Forest Landowner Office was created in the Department of Natural Resources, which Tammy heads now. One of the enabling pieces of that was some money to help understand where small forest landowners were on the landscape and some demographics about them. And one of the requirements of the Small Forest Landowner Office at the Department of Natural Resources was they submit a report every 4 years to legislature with some trends about small landowners in particular. Well, in order to do any of that, you have to know something about them, which we didn't at the time. So the DNR gave us a little bit of money to create what was the first map of small forest landowners around the state. And I'm going to tell you another thing here before I show you all the rest of these slides is I think you guys know all the stuff that I'm going to tell you. So, but I want to show it to you anyway because it's kind of fun. So this is the first map of small forest landowners in the state of Washington. One of the original thoughts was that the small owners were all in the low elevation ranges where the big salmon streams were. And so there was going to be some disproportionate impact to small landowners versus large landowners. And that was one of the first questions that the Small Forest Landowner Office asked us back in 2001. So we went to all the counties, asked them for their tax roll information so that we could go through that and using the land use information from the assessors, figure out where all the forested properties were, go through all the names of all of those owners so we could classify them into industrial ownerships, state lands, small private lands and whatnot. So there was no spatial information at the time. All we had was these tabular data that had the legal descriptions for all of your properties in it. And so we had to go through that and write a program to actually build these kind of spatial shapes so that we could make a map out of it. One thing that we learned from this is that we needed better data. It wasn't telling us a lot of the things we needed to know about where these landowners were relative to fish streams, a lot of the riparian stuff, which was one of the big concerns at the time. So this handsome crowd went to DC and lobbied for some money to build a database that was more spatially explicit and had a bunch of additional information in it. And they were successful, and in 2005 actually got an earmark, a federal earmark that was directed to the University of Washington, where I was, to do a much more thorough and detailed analysis of the forest lands in Washington State, and not just small forest landowners, but all forest lands. And in order to do that, we actually expanded things a little bit, and we decided, you know what, if we're going to get all these forest lands, we might as well just get every square inch of the state. So we did. So we went to the counties and asked them for their spatial data, which was coming online now as technologies advanced and counties became more sophisticated. And we decided, since we were doing this and collecting all this information, it was probably really valuable to some other organizations, namely state agencies. So we worked with a lot of the state agencies to figure out what they needed in terms of spatial data like this across the state, and formed this working group, which existed for many years, and we made many versions of this sort of statewide parcel database on which all of our understanding of the forest lands was created. So out of that, it took us a couple years. We started collecting data in 2007, 2009. We produced this map, which is the first sort of spatially explicit. This is every square inch of ownership across the state. We know who owns it, when they bought it, what the land use is, how much the assessor is taxing you for it, whether or not you're enrolled in a tax advantage program, on and on and on. Okay, so very detailed database for the whole state. This required collecting data from not only all 39 counties in the state, but 3 or 4 state agencies, 2 or 3 federal agencies, and then integrating all this into a single data set. This is a monumental piece of work. If you believe the assessors, there's more land area in Washington than actually exists. So one of the things the first thing we all wanted to know, of course, was, okay, how many small forest landowners are there out there? What are we talking about? We're talking about family forest landowners. And we got into lots of arguments about how to define these things, what size to use as a minimum size, how much forest you needed to have, all this kind of stuff, and trying to quantify all this. And so we had to work with a number of agencies to kind of come up with some reasonable definitions. But we finally agreed on this sort of like minimum. You have to have at least a half an acre of forest on an acre of forest land at the very minimum to be considered counted in one of these things. And really, you probably need 4 or 5 acres to really think that you're going to be harvesting anything. Anyway, we argued about all this stuff, but what we learned is there's about 3.2 million acres of family forest land in the state. Now, this is just looking at the forested bits. If you think of small forest landowners as, a lot of them, you're an agricultural landowner, you've got livestock or something, but then along one edge of the valley, you've got some forest that goes up the hillside too, right? So you're also a forest landowner. So if you look at the total land base that could be considered what small forest landowners are on, it's actually substantially more, if that makes sense. So in terms of differences between small privates and the larger ones, in terms of acres, looking across the state, on the west side, it's about a third of the land base, the working forest land base, as we might call it, on private lands is small forest landowners, but it's only 17% of the harvest. So a lot different management practices obviously are happening on small forest lands than on the industrial lands. East side, it's kind of flipped around. 3/4 of the land is family forests, and about a third of the harvest over there. So we can quantify all of this kind of stuff, and I've shown these kinds of things before, but this is, family forest ownership as a percent of the area in the county. Just looking at the forested lands, and you can see what you already know. You know where your members are. It's Stevens County, Spokane County. You can see them here. But just different ways of slicing and dicing this data, and we've got this massive data set that we can look at this stuff from so many different perspectives and views. This is owners and acres, so we can break it up by industrial and non-industrial, tribal owners. It goes on and on. State owners, federal owners, all this kind of stuff. The point here is not any one number on there, but just to show you the kind of information you can generate when you've got a data set like this. Okay, so I'll show you a few of the things we've done with this. This is kind of getting towards one of those questions that was asked for me to come and talk about. The distribution of ownership sizes, and the vast majority, 75% of the small forest landowners lands are less than 10 acres, and this isn't parcels. This is contiguous pieces of land owned by the same owner. So it could be multiple small parcels or whatnot. So it's a relatively there's relatively few owners that have more than let's say 100 acres or so. And you can do this for fish streams as well. Of course, this was a big interest 15 years ago. Everyone was asking these questions about disproportionate impacts because of the SBIS that had been done. So we were able to quantify that as well, looking at the amount of stream length that different owners have. So again, this is looking at ownerships, so contiguous ownerships. The vast majority have less than 1,000 feet of fish stream on these properties, which is quite different, obviously, when you compare that to industrial owners, just because of the size of their ownership. Those all changes. Anyway, more maps. We can look at all this. This is sort of that same bar chart, looking where the ownerships are, but on a map. So we've made tons of maps like this over the years, looking at also by watershed. So one of the big questions was cumulative impacts by watershed. If the small owners are using a different rule set, perhaps for harvesting on buffers, what are the likelihood of exceeding some threshold for in a cumulative impact sense? And we did a bunch of work to quantify that across all of the watersheds in the state at both this WOW level and at the water resource inventory area, the WIRA level, across the state, and worked with the DNR to kind of share that information with them to come up with an understanding of the likelihood of or sort of risk of any one watershed exceeding some threshold. So in terms of the differences between small owners and big owners, there are a lot of differences. Looking at buffers, we can kind of conclude that there's a significant amount of land in buffers. It's somewhere around 15% that's now in this sort of conservation status. That's a big hit compared to what it was before. Looking at the ownership sizes, small owners have smaller contiguous ownerships, but they're still substantial. And you could see here we were able to map American Tree Farm System properties and Washington Farm Forestry Association properties because they shared their membership roles with us. So we were actually able to go into the parcel database, match up the landowner names and addresses, and actually map not only where they live, but then where their tree farms are as well. So you can see kind of the differences among different memberships as well too, which is kind of interesting. In terms of geography, I think you all know that small landowners are much closer to urban areas than industry lands, which of course creates some different pressures on those lands. The small lands really are the buffer between that sort of expanding ex-urban area and the industrial lands, and so I think the industrial owners appreciate having you all as neighbors because you deal with, I think, the bulk of the complaints from others because you're closer to those residential dwellings. Small owners are just a lot closer to development. So that creates some unique challenges for you. In terms of development potential, we've done a lot of work looking at modeling the economics on forest lands at the individual parcel level based on site productivity, based on physical constraints on the property, buffers, things like that, and actually modeling forest growth and discounting this back to a sort of present value and comparing that to the parcel value. Because of things like this, where small ownerships are generally flatter, they're generally closer to public roads, makes them more attractive for developers, right? So, a lot of things that make sense when you think about it, but wasn't part of the conversation some years ago. We all know this, that industry lands are higher in the watershed in general, and also that small owners have much more fragmented ownerships, right? So that's kind of getting towards that question of cumulative impact. Because of the distributed nature of the small forest landowner lands, it generally has a smaller impact on any one place, right? You don't go into a single watershed and kind of work your way up like you see sometimes on industry lands. So a lot of pressure on small forest lands in terms of conversion potential. They're attractive from a developer's perspective, like I was saying. Most of the small forest landowner lands in Washington, east side and west side, the highest and best use, according to the assessors, is for development, right? So there's very few places where the highest and best use is actually still forestry, according to our appraisers and assessors. So there's different mechanisms that put pressure on these lands. And we've done some work looking at actually kind of how land goes from being forested to developed. A lot of people think industry makes these big sales and they turn into these housing developments. The work we've done actually has shown that that's not true. Industry sells to small owners, and small owners have them for a generation, and then the small owners subdivide and it goes into development. So a lot of people thought that the big industry guys were the ones doing a lot of development, and it turns out based on our work that that's actually not true, which is kind of interesting. So different factors affecting both large owners and small, of course, and the industrial owners. They got accountability to shareholders. They have to make money. They have investment time horizons. Small owners, different pressures, right? You have an aging population for a lot of you. You have retirement needs, estate taxes, passing property on to the next generation, finding interest from the next generation in continuing to manage as forest land. So just differences among the two groups in the pressures that are facing both of you. Or all of you. This is, again, getting back to that conversion risk kind of thing. We've done a lot of work looking at the difference between highest and best use and development value, and the value is continuing to manage as forest land. What this basically says is the entire Puget Sound Basin is kind of at risk of conversion. And if we really want to hold on to these lands, we need to figure out how to make forestry whole again through either investments from, like we do with agriculture, where there's a discounted taxes and you don't ever have to pay them back, versus forestry where we have discounted taxes until you harvest and then you pay a timber tax, right? So maybe something that's more along the lines of what agriculture does, where it's being subsidized by the taxpayer. So anyway, Eastern Washington, very hard to make money over there as a forest landowner. We've done a lot of work looking at prioritizing fish passage placement stuff. So triple FTP, we've talked about that a little bit. Early on, one of the thoughts was to try and prioritize based on cost benefit. So replacing a culvert that's going to open up more habitat than another, and also depending, like Mark was saying, lower in the watershed, if you can't get there because the Department of Transportation has a blockage, maybe there's a better investment somewhere else in the watershed. We did a lot of work looking at that early on, and that was fell out of favor in favor of just a first in line sort of thing. But again, once you have data like this, you can do all of these great types of analyses to try and really get the most bang for the buck. Here's a map of WFFA and American Tree Farm System ownerships in the state. This was a fun thing to put together. You can kind of see the background's a little tough here. I apologize for that. But the green is all the small forest landowners, and then the orange here is the WFFA memberships, and the yellow is the American Tree Farm System. This is from some years ago, but it's kind of nice to actually be able to see the distribution of your membership. This database is used extensively by WSU Extension, by researchers at the University of Washington and at WSU for doing mailings for landowner field days, for doing surveys for various studies at the university. Dozens and dozens and dozens of mailings and educational events have benefited from this database. Looking forward, so we did this work back in 2007, 2008, 2009 to build this first data set. In 2010, the Department of Natural Resources asked us if we could do an assessment looking at biomass across the state, biomass for jet fuel, using residuals from forest slash. Fortunately, we had this database that we'd built that was funded by this line item in the federal budget because of the lobbying efforts by WFFA and the Family Forest Foundation. So fortunately, we had this, and we were able to work with the DNR to build this system to analyze biomass around the state. And with that, we were able to make some improvements to the database, which I'm going to talk about a little bit, and then tell you how we're going to do this going forward. We were able to not only go to the counties and get all of the data on where everybody owned everything, but we decided to start putting in a bunch of other information as well. So streams and lakes and buffers, a bunch of physical characteristics, but the big one here is forest inventory. So we were able to use some remotely sensed products that are calibrated against plots on the ground to actually put inventory across the whole state as well. And so this is coming from satellites, from the Landsat satellite that's at 30 meters meters, and we squish all this data into this big database that creates trillions of these little polygons around the state that are combinations of various things that we can use to look at where forests are, what the owner class is, the management class is. These are kind of different because there's public owners, but then there's within that there's municipal, federal, that kind of thing. Where the buffers are, core buffers, inner buffers, outer buffers, and these are different on state lands, different on private lands, different on federal lands. So modeling all of this across the whole state in a very detailed way. Slopes, all these kinds of things. So we've squished all this into this massive database, which is terabytes. It's huge. We can look at board foot, per acre, all this kind of stuff across the whole state. And with that, we can run all sorts of different models, all sorts of different what-if scenarios, policy questions. What if we do this? What might be the outcome? How much of this thing might get generated if we make a different policy based on this? So out of this, we can get economics. We can get harvest volumes over time. We can do assessments. We did for the Washington Hardwood Commission, looking at available hardwood volumes over time. We can do assessments on that. All sorts of different things that it's really useful for. And it has been really useful, not just for us, not at the university, and not just for the studies that we've done, but for hundreds of agency projects. So we've shared this data widely with various agencies, and it's been used on hundreds and hundreds of different projects. So the value of that initial investment that was made by your membership, I don't know how many times it's been multiplied over, but it's a lot. It's had a really big impact across the state. So you all should be very proud of that. Finally, after many years, it looks like we are going to get an investment by the state in actually improving some of this information. So I think Elaine talked about this a little bit earlier. This bill, hopefully, with the governor's pen stroke, will get signed along with the budget as well, which will be funded to actually start building another version of this whole database, which we have a retrospective. So now we can go back and look and compare it to what was in 2007. Look at the changes in ownership over time. Look at what actual conversion rates have been, and look at a number of other factors as well. That's going to be starting hopefully this summer if it's all funded, and we're going to have an advisory board, and we're going to invite members of your membership and state agencies and others to participate in that, to make sure we're answering the right questions and thinking about things the right way. This is just a couple of things that people have said they've done with this database. So we don't give it to them for free. They got to tell us what they're going to do with it and what the value of it is. This is just part of the list of the things that people have done with this data. So it's been a huge asset. I really appreciate getting to work on this project. It's been really fun over the past 20 years. It has set my career in a specific path that I very much enjoy. So thanks for having me here, and I'm going to be here the rest of the day. So if you got any ideas about things we ought to be looking at going forward, please share them with me.